we are very happy to have a very special guy who is going to be talking about a guy who's been hiding there for, Tom says, 10 years. Our local hero, Fitz Porter. William Marvel has written literally dozens of books about the Civil War, about Lincoln. He's working on one now about the assassination of Lincoln, I believe. Of which
It's about basically Copperhead opinion.
Well, we're very pleased to have him come and talk about Fitz Porter, and hopefully we'll be excited to look up what's happening with the Fitz Porter project. Mr. Marvel.
As if that weren't enough, I understand I have to wear this.
You have to turn it on first.
I have to turn it on. Okay. We're about to find out whether someone who spends most of his life in the 19th century can operate 21st century equipment. How is that?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Oh boy. Ad hoc seems to be the story of my life.
That really is wearing a wire.
Okay. Now, let's just test whether this is going to work, and it doesn't appear to.
Right? I think you pointed
Right.
Nope.
Doesn't seem to be working.
Batteries.
Maybe. There's a light on.
Yeah, the light is there.
You have to point it at something.
You need to point it at the computer.
Ah,
That'll.
but still nothing.
Might be too far
There.
away.
Listen,
Ah.
It's consistent.
I wonder if probably one of the other.
I could hit the advance button over there.
I will do it.
Okay.
You tell me when.
Oh,
hit the
well.
button.
When you see the button.
That's like Sharon.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, well, here's. Yeah,
Perfect.
I won't try to be a technician tonight. So, I reckon you mostly know of, but don't know who Fitz Porter was. He was, you can go ahead to the next slide. He was born in,
We found the problem.
Wow.
yeah. There. Okay, back to the house. That house. In 1822, which is now, I think, 32 Livermore Street. It's about 500 yards from here, which is a lot easier to do when it isn't raining. The house used to sit in Haven Park, but they moved it, as I understand, out of the park to make room for what became Porter's statue. We're going to be going pretty quickly through these.
Just say when.
Go ahead. This is, there's no picture of Fitz Porter's father. His father died either drunk or crazy in an insane asylum in Somerville, I guess, Massachusetts. So his uncle, Commodore David Porter, sort of looked out for him. He didn't have him in the house, but he did get him into West Point, and you can go through the next couple of slides quickly too. Immediately after West Point, he went to Mexico, and in that previous slide you could see the previous slide there. You can see his artillery battery off to the right in the distance. And then in the next slide you see the aqueduct leading into Mexico City. Why don't I use this here pointer? After the castle of Schlossbeck was captured, the army swept across two causeways. This is the one Porter was on, and he was wounded on the way. Next slide, please. So he came out of the war with two brevets. He was a first lieutenant, had a brevet as captain and major, and was assigned soon thereafter to West Point, where he served for about 5.5 years on faculty. He was teaching artillery tactics, and for a time he was the adjutant to the post superintendent, Robert E. Lee.
Well,
Immediately after leaving West Point, he went to Kansas, next slide, where he was during the hunt for John Porter, for John Brown. He met Joe Johnston, another Virginia native and future Confederate general. And next, in 1857, he became the adjutant, the sort of private secretary to Albert Sidney Johnston. So in 3 years, he was closely associated with 3 of the 5 future Confederate full generals. What could be more incriminating than that? He and Johnston spent 3 years in Utah, starting with the Utah War, and then when that ended, they stayed at the post, and they came back in the this was their quarters out in Utah, near what's now Provo. And then they came back in 1860, just before secession. And Porter, who was in the Adjutant General's Department at the time, was sent to Charleston Harbor before the war, November, I guess, of 1860, to assess the defenses. And he didn't think that Fort Moultrie was very defensible. He didn't think that the post commander, Colonel Gardner, was very efficient. Gardner had been the commander of his artillery regiment in Mexico. Another officer thought that Gardner would be better suited as the postmaster of a crossroads village. So he, Robert, the president, replaced the commander there with, what's his name, Robert Anderson, who ultimately moved the garrison out to Fort Sumter, which you see here after the first bombardment. Next, he comes back to Washington. He's appointed colonel of one of the new regiments, but that regiment doesn't exist yet, so he has nothing to do. His old friend George McClellan has just been appointed commander of the army around Washington, and he wanted a lot of young friends of his to replace some of these old fuddy-duddies who were superannuated in many cases, both physically and intellectually, at least in terms of military aspects of that. And he and Porter became McClellan became very close friends. Porter was essentially McClellan's confidant. He wasn't his second in command. He wasn't senior enough for that. But we can go to the next slide. They did go to the peninsula together, and this is the observation balloon they had with them. It was Thaddeus Lowe from Jefferson, New Hampshire, brought this balloon down, and Porter and other generals would use it for observation. One morning he went out to the balloon, and the aeronaut who was supposed to take him up wasn't there. So he got in and starts getting the balloon, the basket ready. He's throwing out the ballast and throwing out the ropes. And so there's one rope left, and it broke. And he starts up into the air, and the ground crew is shouting at him, telling him where the nozzle is. It's in the netting of the balloon. They tied it up there so it wouldn't drag on the ground. So as he's about 1,000 feet in the air, he's got to climb out up the side of the balloon in the netting to get the nozzle and bring it back down. Meanwhile, the gondola is swaying back and forth in the wind. And here he is, 1,000 feet in the air. He has to hope the basket's going to be there when he drops. And it was. So he made his observations and then crash landed on the empty headquarters tent of a New York regiment. 6 weeks later, the Union Army is much closer to Richmond. And the former commander of the Confederate Army, Joe Johnston, his friend, had been wounded, and Robert E. Lee took over. And Lee took the bulk of his army, the largest army he ever commanded, out of Richmond, across the Chickahominy River to attack McClellan's army in what he supposed would be a surprise. And Porter, who is pictured here, devised a plan with McClellan for Porter, with his single corps, to hold off Lee's entire army, while McClellan, on the other side of the river, made a stab at Richmond, which they presumed, at least Porter presumed, would be lightly defended. McClellan made the stab. He met some resistance, gave up, which was his MO.
Yeah.
So the entire battle was sacrificed for that. But Porter did manage to hold off the entire Confederate army from dawn until just about dusk. At dusk, while he was asking for reinforcements and they were on the way, the Confederates broke through their lines. And that led to a retreat that lasted for most of a week and took them to the James River. And the last battle of that week's fighting was Malvern Hill, where Porter was again in command, and he inflicted the worst defeat Lee had during that campaign. I think we can go to the next one. Meanwhile, the war was kind of changing. While McClellan was trying to get to Richmond from the southeast, Lincoln appointed this man and gave him a new army made up of scraps of troops around northern Virginia to attack Richmond from the north. It wasn't just the direction that was different about them. McClellan and Porter were conservatives. They favored a war to restore the Union. They felt that including emancipation, which Lincoln was talking about, would be a distraction, that it would probably alienate a lot of soldiers, which it did. But this fellow, Pope, was willing to, he was a Republican, which is rare in the old army, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary to gain fame for himself, but also to pursue Lincoln's goals. And Lincoln eventually called McClellan back from again, still at the very gates of Richmond, had him come all the way back by sea to Washington to reinforce Pope piecemeal. And the first troops to arrive were under Porter himself, and he reached him just before the Battle of Bull Run, which is next. This map here gives you an idea of the discrepancy between the mind of John Pope and reality. Pope had an idea that he had been flummoxed by Stonewall Jackson a few days before. Jackson had gotten behind him and destroyed his supply depot and the tracks back to Washington. And then he hid out here, waiting to strike Pope again when he should come by. Well, he stumbled by. Jackson attacked him, and Pope thought that they were on this sort of axis, north-south, that Porter, he thought, was pretty much behind the Confederates. All he had to do was go across this road and attack them from behind, and they would have been driven into retreat, right? Well, not really. This was more the line that they were fighting. This unfinished railroad was Jackson's makeshift breastworks. And there was a big gap here between Porter and the rest of the army. And if we can go just to the next slide and then back, this is Irvin McDowell, and as we go back, he will be coming up here. He ranked Porter. He had a corps of his own. He meets Porter here, and they conclude that this gap is too big, and McDowell says, wait here, I'll go back and fill that gap, and then we'll attack. Well, he goes back, and he goes up around here somewhere and sits the rest of the day. He doesn't communicate much with Pope. He doesn't communicate with Porter at all. Porter is sending him messages, what's going on, where are you? And nothing happens all day. At the end of the day, Pope, who has this fantasy that Jackson is now pretty much in retreat, orders Porter to attack. You know, he's not there, he can't see what's going on, but he orders him to attack, and he thinks no one is there. But there is Longstreet's Corps, the other half of the Confederate Army, standing right in the way. And the order, by the way, didn't get to Porter until 15 minutes before dark. And so he called off the attack, and that's what caused trouble later. We can skip over Irvin McDowell now and go on to this picture. When Pope was at the end of Second Bull Run, was driven back to Washington, his army in complete disarray, and Lee, at the same time, circles around and invades Maryland. So Lincoln, who had just deposed McClellan, has to reappoint him to go after Lee. He wanted to court-martial Porter immediately because he thought that Porter, who is here, had failed Pope deliberately because of their probable political differences. But while the army was in Maryland, he didn't dare do that. He needed McClellan here, and McClellan needed Porter. After Lee had been beaten at Antietam, Lincoln meets McClellan here at Antietam. This is October 3rd, 1862. Porter at the time asked him, "Are you satisfied with my explanation of Second Bull Run?" Lincoln said, yes. But a month or so later, a month after this photo is taken, he deposes McClellan again because it's politically convenient. The last elections of the year are over. He doesn't have to worry about losing elections because Democrats are upset at McClellan's removal. So he decides to court-martial Porter as well. And we can go on now to Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who gets the order to create the court-martial. Now, in most cases where the commander of an army charges a subordinate with some crime that's subject to court-martial, the president has to appoint the court. But they didn't think of that at the time. So Stanton here, who is himself an old conservative Democrat who has turned coat with the changing of power in Washington, he decides that Porter has to go because he can't get McClellan, but he can get Porter, which is his proxy victim. Next fellow is probably Joseph Holt. This is the man whom Stanton appointed Judge Advocate General the day President Lincoln first indicated he wanted to court-martial Porter back in September. They had to wait through the Battle of Antietam, but come November, Holt, who had served in Buchanan's cabinet with Stanton, was himself another old conservative Democrat who was proving his zeal as a radical Republican. He was intent on getting, if not McClellan, Porter. So the two of them devise a court composed of the president of the court, David Hunter, one of the few radical Republicans in the old army. Next general is, back to Garfield. One up. There we go. Garfield was he also was an abolitionist, which is synonymous with radical Republican at the time. He had been living at the house of Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, another radical Republican from New Hampshire. And while Garfield was there, Chase invited Irvin McDowell to have dinner with him several times. McDowell convinced Garfield that Porter was guilty. He admitted it in letters home, and he didn't recuse himself from the court. Instead, he acted as sort of an unofficial judge advocate helping to create objections that would interfere with the defense. Next fellow is Silas Casey. One of the French princes on McClellan's staff said Casey looked like a bald parrot and he mounted a horse like a sick monkey. If I translated the journal correctly. He had been an underperforming division commander in Porter's corps. Porter asked McClellan to get rid of him. He did. Casey held a grudge forever. Not only did Stanton know that, so did President Lincoln. Next fellow, Ethan Allen Hitchcock. He had retired from the Army. This picture was taken probably 12 years before the war. Early days of photography. He was, people in the War Department referred to him as an old woman. He complained about how much Stanton bullied him. He always swore that he would read him the riot act. He never did. He did pretty much as Stanton told him. Next is Napoleon Buford, I suspect, yes. And he had never really served in the Army. He had resigned as soon as he graduated from West Point in 1835 and didn't get reappointed until the Civil War. But Stanton, for some reason, liked him. When he was still a colonel of an Illinois regiment, Stanton thought about giving him command of the Army of the Potomac. No one could understand why. But both Buford and Hitchcock, the previous guy, Stanton invited to his house for Thanksgiving dinner the day after the trial started. And you can bet they weren't talking turkey. They were talking about the trial and not objectivity. The next fellow, this is a long court. John Slow was described by a classmate of his as a close personal friend of Secretary Stanton. He would do whatever he intuited that Stanton wanted. Next, we have Rufus King, who commanded a division in the Battle of Second Bull Run. Should not have been on the court at all because he himself was probably eligible for court-martial. His performance was so bad he was replaced on, I guess it was the morning of August 29th. And historians believed for a long time that his excuse, or his son's excuse, that he was suffering epileptic seizures. I found a couple of diaries of staff officers who knew better, who described him as drinking heavily during the campaign. The next general was also at Bull Run, James Ricketts. His assignment with his division was to guard the road from Thoroughfare Gap to prevent Longstreet's corps of the Confederate Army from reaching the battlefield, or at least to notify Pope that they were coming. He retreated without orders, took a roundabout route. No one knew where he was for 24 hours, and consequently Longstreet got to the field and surprised everyone. He too should have been court-martialed. Both he and King probably understood that Stanton appointed them to the court for their own redemption. Next, we have the last court member, Benjamin Prentice. You might think of him as the most innocent of all. His only crime was he had started making speeches in favor of emancipation, and so it was clear that he was politically satisfactory for the court. I don't know who's next, but let's go on. It might. Benny Roberts. I told you that the president was supposed to appoint any court that was convened on charges brought by the commanding general of an army. Well, John Pope was Porter's commanding officer, so the president should have appointed that court. They didn't realize that until too late, Stanton and Holt. So they got this fellow to agree to press the charges. He was a staff officer of Pope's. Benny Roberts was also in Buford's class of 1835 at West Point. In 1839, he resigned from the Army to avoid court-martial for having lost $3,000 in government funds that was entrusted to him, which he invested in some speculation and lost it all. But he had political connections, and he got reappointed in 1846 during the Mexican War. But 3 years later, he was court-martialed again and dismissed for various peculations. He was signing pay orders for forage for horses that didn't exist for men who weren't present. He was selling government property, and he was lying to everyone who asked him about it. So he was court-martialed not only for the various corruptions in selling government property, but for conduct unbecoming a gentleman, for lying to everyone. He was also court-martialed again in 1857, but whoever put the file number on that court case file put an extra number on it, and so I've never been able to find that file. But obviously he survived it because he was still in the Army at the beginning of the war. So this is the man who filed the charges, and he would say, when asked, that if Porter had attacked when ordered, the result would have been unmitigated defeat of the Confederate Army, even though he couldn't point to where it was on a map where Porter was. He didn't know anything about it. That sort of opinion was accepted by the court. When the defense asked questions such as, had Porter refused to attack when he realized that it was impossible, that he was hopelessly outnumbered, would he have been disobedient then? That sort of question for an opinion was not admissible. Every single objection by the defense was overruled. Every single objection by the prosecution was sustained. Who is next here? The clairvoyant, Thomas Smith. Another man who he had never served a day in the Army until he was appointed lieutenant colonel of an Ohio cavalry regiment. Never much served with it. He was pretty much a staff officer, and he offered some of the most incriminating evidence about Porter. He said he knew within 5 minutes, he had only met Porter once for 5 minutes, and he knew that Porter was a traitor. How? What did he say? Well, I can't remember what he said. But it was his sneering tone. Well, what was the sneering part? Well, as for the sneering, it was sort of suppressed. Well, how did you know he was a traitor? Well, he looked like a man with a crime on his face. And that was accepted.
Yeah.
Not only was that accepted, but when Porter was convicted, the president was supposed to get the case file and review it for fairness and that sort of thing. The file was 900 and some pages of manuscript long. The president didn't have time for that, so he asked Holt to summarize it. Well, Holt did, not in the way a judge advocate is supposed to, presenting the good with the bad, the incriminating with the exculpatory. No, his was an utter condemnation of Porter, and he used this man's statement, he looked like a man with a crime on his mind, to emphasize how wonderful it was that this man could see that. And Lincoln was a lawyer, and he should have realized that was ridiculous. But what was Lincoln's problem at the moment? What was the situation? Let's go to the next one. He had replaced McClellan with Pope, and it led to absolute disaster. He replaced McClellan with Burnside. Burnside had lost the Battle of Fredericksburg, another absolute disaster. This is a cartoon from the back of Harper's Weekly. Columbia is saying, "Where are my 15,000 sons murdered at Fredericksburg?" And Lincoln is, well, it probably reminds him of a story. This is General Halleck in front of him, the ding-toed fellow. It looks like he's saying, "Who, me?" And to his right there, looking like he's about to wet his pants, is Edwin Stanton, who spent a good part of the war in that position. So they were under tremendous public pressure. And after the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside made another attempt to make an end run around Lee's army. And because of a couple of backbiting subordinates who went to Lincoln, Lincoln asked him to hold off. Don't do that yet. So for 2 weeks of very good weather, Burnside held off, and then finally Lincoln said, all right, go ahead. And what we can see the next slide is the Army, which got about 24 hours out from its camps in this pouring rain before the mud got so deep that it took them 2 or 3 days to get back to camp. So he knew he was going to have to replace Burnside too. And it looked like he was just, I almost slipped. He was screwing up left and right. If you convicted Porter, though, that absolved him of any complicity, any responsibility for Pope's disaster, especially if Porter was the one who caused the disaster. It didn't take care of Fredericksburg or the Mud March, but Lincoln signed the order, even despite that painfully amateur summary by Holt. And I don't think he did so entirely innocently. So while the rest of his comrades are going on to fame and glory, Porter goes on to be a mining engineer in Colorado. That's the town he went to where, by the way, he had political trouble with people because they were, there were Republicans and Democrats out there too, and a lot of people tried to stigmatize him because of the court-martial. After the war, he did a number of other occupations. He served as a police commissioner in New York, fire commissioner. He was superintendent of construction for the new New Jersey Asylum for the Insane at Morristown, which, as you might guess from the size of that building, had the longest contiguous foundation of any building in the United States when it was built. And he superintended all of it up to the roof. And that building was, I saw videos of that building in 2015. It had been abandoned for years, so the interior was pretty shoddy, but the building itself was as straight and solid as it had been over 140 years before. Meanwhile, while he's trying to make a living, he's also trying to get a review of his case, to have people look at it again. Here he is having at a party with a bunch of other Mexican War officers at General Patterson's house in Philadelphia. This is Porter here, who's shaved off his beard and replaced it with mutton chops. And here is then President Grant, who wasn't very helpful as president to Porter. In fact, he suggested to him privately that he ought to just give it up because it wasn't going to do him any good, and he was just really keeping his disgrace current, which some people would consider good advice. But ultimately, after Grant left office, Hayes appointed a review panel in 1877, and they spent the better part of 2 years going over all the evidence. And I'm already over time, aren't I? They finally decided, after hearing from Confederates who knew where Longstreet was, after hearing from perjurers whom Pope's agents had hired to come to the court to say, oh yes, I was with Captain Pope when he delivered the order to Porter, and it was full daylight. He didn't, the excuse that it was near dusk was insufficient. One man said, yes, I saw them at Bethlehem Church, and the defense asked, well, how did you recognize Bethlehem Church? And he said, by the steeple. Well, Bethlehem Church never had a steeple, and during the Battle of Bull Run, it was a tumble down ruin. So their perjury became obvious, but was never prosecuted because it wasn't a criminal proceeding. But the panel finally decided that yes, Porter deserved complete exoneration. He had done nothing wrong.